Coming up on Theater Talk, was there a concern that it was too Jewish?
There was a concern that it was too Jewish from producers that Bach, Harnick, and Stein were taking the property too early on. And people were saying, well, this is all very nice. And apparently one of them said, but what are we going to do when we run out of Hadassah groups?
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation. From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
Our guest is Alisa Solomon, author of Wonder of Wonders, A Cultural History of Fiddler on the Roof. She's a professor at the Columbia School of Journalism and a theater critic, and returning to Theater Talk for the second time. Welcome back, Alisa.
Thank you.
I'm curious about the phrase cultural history. So this is not your typical backstage, here's all the gossip from what happened in the show. You're really looking at it from a broader perspective of why the show was so important, its influence in the culture of America and immigrants.
That's right. Although I do tell the backstage stories.
You do?
Well, there's some. Well, you can't. Well, you got Jerome Robbins to deal with.
That's right. There's always good
stuff.
stories with him. So I do tell about the making of the show and try to talk about the artistry and the mechanics of it, the architecture of it, really, if we're talking about Jerry Robbins, and some of the stories and the gossip, if you wish. But at the same time, I'm trying to do more than that and place it into a wider context and to ask, where did this work come from? Why was it important? Who cared about it? What was the what was the soil that it grew out of? And then why did it blossom forth?
And where did it come from? Can you give us that story? What you
It came from short stories by Sholem Aleichem, and that much most people know. He was an important Yiddish writer. Most Americans think of him and have long thought of him as this kind of folksy humorist. But in fact, he was a very sophisticated literary man who wrote novels, essays, all kinds of literary works in a very deliberate, artistic way, and he fashioned himself as this kind of character. I mean, that he was a very urbane, educated man who played the stock market in Kiev, lost his family fortune, had to hide from creditors, etc.
Yeah, a fascinating character that you painted in the book.
Yeah, and he invented Tevye the dairyman, Tevye the milchiker, in 1894, and wrote a series of stories about him over about a 20-year period. And Fiddler is drawn from those stories.
It was fascinating, your stories about Sholem Aleichem and his struggles to bring his work to the stage, and how sad that story is.
It is. It's such a pathetic story.
He wanted to be in the theater, didn't he?
He was desperate to be in the theater. He really wanted to make it on the Yiddish Broadway of the time. The
Second
Yiddish
Avenue,
theater, of the turn of the century. And he came here after having had a pretty good success with one of his first plays in Warsaw. And he was always trying to make some money. He was always a little down on his luck financially.
Yes, as successful as he was not financially.
Yeah, as a fiction writer, he was the most popular Yiddish writer, but he still needed a buck, and he thought theater was going to be his savior. Not the last person to think that, I guess.
No, that's true.
But so he came here, and he had two of the greatest actor, manager, directors of the Yiddish theater ever to produce his plays, Boris Tomaszewski in one theater and Jacob Adler in another. He had two shows open on the same night in February 1907, and both were colossal flops. And he just couldn't get over it, and he kept trying and trying, and it was just astonishing to me to go back to his letters and to see him sending his scripts again and again.
And getting rejection letters.
And getting rejected again and again.
Wow.
And then he died in poverty, didn't he? He not?
He died, I mean, not complete poverty. By then, his works got official publication in Russia, and he had, he did a little better. But he did die here without ever having had a hit.
As down on his luck as he was, he had this huge funeral then. I mean, once people sort of were ignoring him, but then when he died, they all came out.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of people
who'd grown up with his stories, probably.
Grown up with his stories, loved his work. And so it's not that they didn't pay attention to him. They did. They loved him as a story writer. They just didn't think his plays were very good. And I think that has to do with the difference between the function of the theater, which is a public form, and was a place where Jewish American immigrants in the Yiddish theater were forging a new American identity. And on the other hand, a book that you read in the privacy of your home, where maybe you have a different kind of attachment. But his plays weren't dealing with this new reality of how to become American. And even though a lot of the Yiddish theater plays, hark back to the old country, they always do it with a kind of tension.
Right.
And his plays just didn't know how to hit that note, and they just didn't work.
Didn't one of his works have pretty good success very soon after he died?
Yes, well, so the Tevye stories were adapted into a play by Sholom Aleichem himself, but he never managed to get it staged during his lifetime. But in 1919, just 3 years after he died, Maurice Schwartz, another great Yiddish actor and director, he created something called the Yiddish Art Theater. And his second season opened with his adaptation, really Sholom Aleichem's adaptation, messed with a little by, as far as we know, by Maurice Schwartz of Tevye der Milchiker, Tevye the dairyman, and it was a big hit.
So Sheldon and Jerry Robbins, they would not have seen that.
They wouldn't have seen that play, but there was a film version that Maurice Schwartz made in 1939, and you can see it. It's on DVD now. It's incredible, and it's nothing like the Tevye we know and love from Fiddler on the Roof. It's a much graver, older, humbler kind of image of Tevye, played by Maurice Schwartz.
And then whose idea was it to take these stories and turn it into a Broadway musical in the golden era of musical theater?
Well, Bach, Harnick, and Stein, as I'm sure they've discussed with you other times they've been on the show, they had worked together before, and they wanted to do a new project. And somebody, I think it was Sheldon Harnick, had gotten his hands on a novel called Wandering Stars. It's terrific. I mean, for theater people, I really recommend it. A Sholem Aleichem novel called Wandering Stars, about two rival troupes of the Yiddish theater in Europe that then come here. It's a sort of star-crossed lover story. It's all over the place. It's a mess in some ways, but the backstage stories are just delightful. It's really fun. And Joe Stein, they all loved it, but Joe Stein said it was just too sprawling and couldn't be contained as a musical. But it got him thinking about Sholem Aleichem. He had grown up with parents who spoke Yiddish. He knew the Tevye stories, and they thought, well, let's look at some other Sholem Aleichem material and see if there's something we like.
But you also talk about before that in the 50s.
Yeah.
There was the play The World of Sholem Aleichem. Howard Da Silva, Jack Guilford was in it.
That's right.
Surely they must have seen that.
Yeah, well, there were two productions that Howard Da Silva and Arnold Pearl, a playwright,
Blacklisted artists, incidentally.
Blacklisted artists,
Which
well, more than incidentally.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, the whole point of their making theater was that they had been blacklisted. Pearl was mostly a radio script writer and later TV, and Da Silva was making movies. And after his success on Broadway, of course, playing Judd in the original Oklahoma. So the only way they could put themselves to work was by making theater, because the theater, God bless our theater industry, had no blacklist.
Although I do have an old New York Post front page that says 1947 House Un-American Activity Committee. It says Broadway redder than films. So there was an attempt. There was an attempt. But theater people didn't cower the way the Hollywood people.
That's right. Equity put a clause in its contract saying against the blacklist. I mean, it was really honorable.
Yeah.
It makes me happy to be in some way attached to the theater. Yeah. So they, Pearl and Da Silva, created this production. The first thing they did was called The World of Sholem Aleichem. It was an evening of 3 short plays. Actually, it wasn't all Sholem Aleichem. There was a story by another Yiddish writer, Peretz, and there was a kind of folk story, Chelm story, that Sholem Aleichem had done a treatment of, but that's not the version that they did. And then there was a Sholem Aleichem story as well. And then there's another Yiddish writer called Mendele Moicher's Forum, who was kind of the narrator of the evening. And so they put these 3 things together. It was a surprise hit. It played
the Barbizon.
Thank you. It played in the Barbizon
Hotel,
the Barbizon Plaza Hotel.
Yes.
They had a little stage in there, and it was an
off-Broadway hit. Yeah.
It was a runaway hit. And because of that hit, they went back to Sholem Aleichem material, and they adapted some of the Tevye stories as well, and they made a straight play called Tevye and His Daughters, which premiered in 1957. Was not as successful. It just didn't really work. But it definitely put Sholem Aleichem in the air in English, and I think sort of made the theater safe for.
But Tevye and His Daughters could be the title of Fiddler on the Roof, because that's what the musical then becomes about.
Absolutely.
Wasn't the working title Tevye for Fiddler on the Roof?
The working title was Tevye. That's right.
Yeah.
Why'd they change it?
I think there's a story that, oh God, I can't remember the phrase. Hal Prince thought it sounded like God.
Too Jewish.
No, I mean, that was a concern of
Too
some.
inspecific. I believe
that
you
was-
said. I believe you said too specific.
He thought it didn't mean anything.
Right.
And he wanted a title that signaled that it was a musical.
Right. Was there a concern that it was too Jewish?
There was a concern that it was too Jewish from producers that Bach, Harnick, and Stein were taking the property too early on. This is before they'd approached Hal Prince and before they had Jerry Robbins aboard. But they were taking it around, and people were saying, well, this is all very nice. And apparently one of them said, but what are we going to do when we run out of Hadassah groups?
We'll take it to Japan, where it's hugely popular
Exactly. Yeah, don't follow that guy's investment advice.
too. Precisely that.
And they were just making a bad prediction on a couple of levels. One, the audience was ready for this material by 1964. But the other thing is that Jerry Robbins came aboard and really pushed it into a place where it operates successfully both on the particular and the universal tracks. So it very specifically speaks to the children of Jewish immigrants, grandchildren of Jewish immigrants, and kind of hailing us with the beauty of our heritage, at the same time as there's nothing that isn't clear to a non-Jewish audience, and the themes are so universal. The generation gap, the sense of loss, the forces of change.
The importance of religion that would have been important to Catholics, not only
Absolutely.
Jews, but when religion had more currency.
Right.
In New York City.
Fraying of
probably,
tradition,
yes.
all of those things.
And you go into a fascinating profile of Jerome Robbins.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting profile of Robbins' working that I've ever read. And you start with telling us about how his grandfather had been on a shtetl and Robbins had gone to visit him. And then you go into Robbins' conflicts himself with being Jewish, which he kind of, you explain it so well, resolved by doing this show.
I think that he did, yes. Yeah, he was very uncomfortable with his Jewish identity as a youngster. He did have very fond memories. He was 6 when he went with his mother back to Poland to visit his grandfather in the shtetl where his father had come from. I was then in Poland. It's that, the borders changed.
Right.
But apart from that, very sort of whimsical description in some of his diary notes. There's nothing else nice about his childhood memories. I mean, the way he described it anyway. And he was very uncomfortable with, I think, with Jewish masculinity, this idea of a kind of wimpy, weak Jewish male stereotype and other things about Jewish identity that he just, like a lot of other people of his generation, other children of immigrants of all kinds, often try to distance themselves from and become very American.
And particularly, I'd say, after the Holocaust.
Yes, so important.
Where there was a sense that, Jews are not going to be pushed into ovens ever again.
Yes, that's right. And so he really ran away from it, and his notes are, and diaries and letters and so on, are full of really richly detailed and in some ways even disturbing descriptions of his discomfort with this. But by the time he's in his 40s, he's thinking about it, he's starting to realize that there's a heritage that he's left behind that maybe has some richness in it that he's missing, and this draft script for the musical lands in his lap from Bach, Harnick, and Stein, and he gets so excited about it. And he sends a telegram to a friend and says, I'm doing this musical based on Sholom Aleichem. It's our people, he says, and he just gets really excited about it.
And then even though he has had a tremendous problem with Zero Mostel because of this naming of names.
Well, we should say Robbins named names and Mostel was blacklisted.
Right. But still, as many people, because you describe in wonderful detail all the people that they auditioned and how scrupulous Robbins was in the auditioning process, and yet Mostel was the first person he thought of, and that's who he wanted. Yeah.
He begged him.
Even though Mostel wouldn't speak directly to him.
That's right. Robbins knew that Mostel was the best man for the job. And Mostel knew that he was the best man for the job. And they both really wanted it to happen. They respected each other as artists, and even though Mostel just baited Robbins all through the rehearsal period, they made beautiful work together.
I won't digress into how Norman Jewison, who directed the film, somehow didn't think Mostel would be the best man for the job, but there you go.
In addition to the show becoming so popular because it's just so good, such a great musical, was there a sense, though, that it also, only 20 years after the Germans tried to wipe out Jewish culture, this show not only celebrates Jewish culture, but lodges it into the mainstream popular culture of America at that time, when Broadway was at the center of that popular
No, that's exactly it. I mean, I think that's a really important reason that this show caught on as deeply as it did. It was the first big work of American popular culture that represented pre-Holocaust Jewish life, you know, in this era. And of course, there'd been other representations, but they were mostly presented in Jewish venues or in forms that people looked at.
Not on the Ed Sullivan Show.
That's right. Well, certainly not on the Ed Sullivan Show. Yeah.
And you describe in scrupulous detail how they were trying to be so careful. Robbins not getting too creepy with the shading of the Holocaust, what was coming to these people when they left the
that's
shtetl,
right.
and yet that we all knew it was.
Well, that's a brilliance of the show, though, because as joyous a musical comedy as it is, you are always aware that many of these people that you're watching in the show are going to die.
Yeah, I mean, it's set in 1905. They don't know it, you know, and
Yeah,
you
of course,
can't
of course.
play it retrospectively, of course, as actors. But yeah, we certainly bring that as an audience to it, and it's part of the poignancy of it, of course.
Another aspect of the book that's so interesting is you talk about how Robbins worked on this show. You said to me outside that Harnick and Bach probably wrote 3 or 4 songs for everyone that remained in the show. They were constantly changing, constantly sculpting it down.
He was a perfectionist. I mean, I think that's part of why a lot of actors found him difficult to work with, or the set designer, Boris Aronson, was driven up the wall by him, because he'd, you know, come and say, oh, that looks nice, but can you move this, you know, can you move the moon over 2 inches? And then 2 days later, so no, move it the other way 4 inches, you know. But what you're saying, Susan, is absolutely right. I mean, he just was not sentimental about things that he worked on or anybody else worked on for a long time. He had like a 10-minute scene. It played in Detroit. The show went to Detroit and Washington before it opened in New York. There was a scene of Tevye like melting down after Chava runs off with Fiedka. And it was this big expressionistic, like forest ballet. It was you know, he thought there needed to be a big dance number in the second act.
Well, that was the style in those days, yeah.
Yeah, and Sheldon Harnick told me that it was just an amazing scene, and a couple people that I spoke who were part of it said it was like really incredible, that everything turned red and actors were moving, you know, behind scenery and making things tilt, and
Zero would go crazy.
And
negative.
Zero went crazy and just kind of, you know, collapsed before everyone's eyes, and and that's drawn directly from one of the Sholom Aleichem stories, who sort of describes him freaking out, and he questions God. Why did you make Gentile and Jews?
Because his daughter ran off with the Gentile.
Yeah, exactly. And they worked and worked and worked on this scene, and
he was not sentimental, Robbins, and
No.
I was always surprised that he kept Sunrise Sunset, which arguably became one of the most sentimental songs that is played at everybody's wedding now. Did Robbins like that song, or maybe it's one of those songs they didn't even think about would be the takeout tune?
Yeah, I don't think they thought it would be the takeout tune. It's true. Robbins's notes to Bach and Harnick and Stein often say, you know, no sentimentality, no adorable schnooks, he would say. You know, these people need to be tough and resilient. And if you compare Fiddler to treatments of Sholom Aleichem in the 50s, Fiddler's a lot less sentimental, in fact.
Yeah.
But that song, you're right, I think it's Sheldon who tells a story that Robbins reacted to the song at some point. He says, I'm thinking of cutting the song because, like, what are people doing? Like, what are they doing? Bach and Harnick said, well, they're singing the song. That's what they're doing.
And we need a hit. Well, did Bach and Harnick know that they'd written a good one of that? Or?
They knew that it was moving. You know, Sheldon talks about the first time they played it at Bach's home, and Bach's wife came into the room and burst into tears hearing it, and that was a sign to him that, you know, they had something.
Yeah.
But you talk about when they're getting ready for the Seder scene, that then he spent days on the table setting.
Yeah,
what was that?
The Sabbath scene, yeah.
The Sabbath scene, driving the actors crazy by, no, you have to move the fork over.
Well, no, but as you say, he scrupulously researched how these people lived.
Yes, he did. And part of what's interesting, I mean, this, you know, maybe gets a little academic, but part of what's very interesting about his research is that the sources that were available to him and his collaborators in 1964 were things that contemporary scholars now recognize as not being very accurate, let's say. So the book Life is with People, for example, which was a sort of ethnography of the shtetl that was published in the 50s, gives a very false representation of the of shtetl life, because it sort of represents this single idyllic notion of, you know, capital T, capital S, the shtetl, when in fact the shtetl all across Eastern Europe were very different from each other in size,
Sure.
in nature, in percentage of population that was Jewish or non-Jewish, whether they were industrial or agricultural, Hasidic or not. But because of the way that book is structured, because it's built on interviews with immigrants who were mostly child immigrants being interviewed many years later, it just isn't what we would regard today as anything that you could base something reliably on, and yet, you know, Robbins called it our Bible.
Yes,
And there are, you know, even lines in the play that come directly from it.
Ironically, now when you hear the word shtetl, I think most people think of a Fiddler on the Roof.
Probably.
The Fiddler on the Roof has replaced
Yes.
that as the description
I
of
think that's exactly right.
of what a shtetl would
Yeah.
be to
And in the
us.
original Tevye stories, Tevye doesn't even live in a shtetl. He lives outside of
That's
the
right, and he comes into town. They
that's right.
unified and created Avnotevka.
That's correct.
Unified. I do want to quickly say that you, after this wonderful description of bringing the show to life in the first place, then you go on to talk about how it's been realized in other ways, including the film, and you go all the way up to the David Laveau version, which also includes Michael Riedel's writing about it. But what?
Just to mention.
With
Well,
just
we
a minute,
have to
but-
get it in context here. So the
Well,
criticism,
that's why I leave
the
it to you.
criticism of David Laveau's production, I believe, was in 2004, if I'm
That's
not
right.
mistaken. And it was my criticism, but I also believe Ben Brantley and others.
Yeah, a lot of people.
That the Jewish soul, I think was an expression used, had been drained from this production of Fiddler on the Roof. And I think Ben called it the Episcopalian on the Roof.
Yes, he did.
But it was a
In your
spirit-
estimation, was that a fair criticism? You must have seen the show.
I did see the show, and I saw it again when Harvey Fierstein replaced Alfred Molina.
Right.
I agree. I don't think it was a great production. I mean, there were aspects of it that I liked. It certainly looked
It was
beautiful.
very pretty.
Yeah.
But it looked like a Chekhov play.
It was definitely a different take. It was a cooler approach. You know, Harvey Fierstein brought some warmth back into
Yeah,
it, I thought.
absolutely.
I would be more cautious about saying that was because the director wasn't Jewish or because the main actor wasn't Jewish. I mean, the show has always had non-Jewish principles. of
As
various
you
kinds.
point out, there were fewer Jewish principles in the original production
right.
than in Laveau's.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, you know, of course, Zero Mustel, you know, grew up in Yiddishkeit and brought, you know,
I mean, we did
all that
notice.
background.
You did notice when you compared some clips of Zero Mostel doing it compared to Alfred Molina. When Zero moves his hips, there's a man who knows the way you moved your hips.
there's
when you
nobody
danced the show.
like him.
And Alfred Molina just didn't
But
have
there's
that.
Jewish actors who don't know that either. I mean, I'm just reluctant to make that like a genetic, you know,
Right.
a genetic matter.
Right.
I think the Jewish soul of the show is in the material, and that any good actor, you know, can bring that out. And you know, I mean, Molina's certainly a great actor.
Yeah. And you feel with Fiddler on the Roof, though, because it was, as you say, Robbins made it universal and it was in the very mainstream Broadway, they didn't really bland down the material, the fundamental material, though, for this musical, did they?
I don't think so, no.
You don't think so?
No. Though, the Sholem Aleichem scholars, the Yiddish literary scholars...
Yeah, because I've heard
they
criticisms
hate
from that
Fiddler.
quarter.
They hate Fiddler.
And their objection is?
Their objection is that it oversimplifies, misrepresents. I mean, the objection that you would have of any kind of adaptation to a Broadway idiom or maybe a Hollywood idiom of a very complex work of literary fiction.
Right.
Yes, it's not the same animal.
Yeah, the
That's
Victor
true.
Hugo scholars probably aren't crazy about Les Miserables.
Precisely.
Yeah, exactly, exactly, and they're true. I mean, you can't argue with them on the merits of the question of, you know, does this have the same level of irony and intricacy that Sholem Aleichem's prose has? No, but it has other things.
Yeah.
And those other things interest me a lot. And the fact that it's so popular and has been so successful all these years makes it a kind of cultural fact that I think is very much worth looking at. And finally, I think Sholem Aleichem would have loved it.
Yeah.
I mean, he wanted to make a killing in the theater.
He would have loved
Go
to
back to your original.
He would love to have collected his
And,
Tony Award.
You know,
my God.
and he knew, and you know, it's in his letters and notes. Even though he would say, "I will not bow to the demands of the theater" and all of that, he changed things all the time. He knew that when you're on stage, that's the means of communication are different, and you're going for something different there. And he was all for it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
And by the way, we should say, I think there's a revival of Fiddler on the Roof in the
2015.
works, right? 2015, back on Broadway. It's never too far away from us.
That's right.
Wonder of Wonders, A Cultural History of Fiddler on the Roof by our guest tonight, Alisa Solomon, thank you very much.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
me.
Alisa.
Thank you.
I can't wait for your Les Mis book.
Lord, who made the lion and the lamb, you decreed I should be what I am. Would it spoil some vast eternal plan if I were a wealthy man?
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, the Noel Coward Foundation, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, plus public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency, and the Theater Development Fund's Technical Accessibility Program, which helps provide closed captioning.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.